Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to celebrate International Women's Day here at the gallery. We are gathered here today to reflect on female agency and to honor the enduring legacies of women who have shaped the discourse of art history, and in particular, Singapore's art history. My name is Adele. I'm Senior Curator here at the gallery. I also lead the Curator programs team, which is organizing today's event. And I will be your MC and moderator for this afternoon. Today's program, Sculpting Her World, the art of Dora Gordine, centers on the life and legacy of the artist Dora Gordine. Gordine was best known for her sculptures and received major public commissions, including works for the former Municipal Building, now part of the National Gallery Singapore. Although brief, her stay in Singapore in the 1930s left a significant mark on the local art scene, establishing her as a pioneering female artist and a trailblazer in the sculptural scene. But despite her accomplishments, she remains relatively little known, or remained relatively little known at the time of her passing. Today, her work can be seen in the gallery's permanent exhibition, Singapore Stories, Pathways and Detours in Art, on level 2 of the City Hall wing. This afternoon, we are very excited to present 2 films, Dorich by filmmaker Annaleena Piel Linnå, and Speculative Entanglements by the artist Erika Tan. The screenings will be followed by a sharing from Dr Fiona Fisher, Curator of the Dorich House Museum, and a conversation between Erika Tan, myself, and Dr Fiona Fisher. Light refreshments will be served in the auditorium foyer after the program. So to describe the films a little bit, commissioned by Dorich House Museum, Dorich is a creative documentary that traces the relationship between Dora Gordine and her husband, Richard Hare, and the creation of their unconventional studio home called Dorich House. Conceived and designed by Gordine herself, it is now preserved as a museum. We are especially delighted that Annaleena has joined us here today in the audience. She's traveled all the way here from London. Please join me in welcoming her. A round of applause. In Speculative Entanglements, the Dorich House Museum becomes the setting for an imagined encounter between 4 women artists: Dora Gordine, Georgette Chen, Kim Lim, and Fay Tan. Fay Tan being the mother of Erika Tan. Whilst there is no evidence that these women ever met, Erika Tan's work speculates on what their conversations might have been, exploring shared questions of artistic practice, identity, and womanhood. The 2-channel film was part of a multifaceted installation, Barang Barang, shown at the Stanley Picker Gallery at Kingston University. And before I actually forget, I want to mention that for Dorich, that this film is available for viewing in the Dorich House Museum, but as Fiona reminds me, that's only on view on a tiny television monitor. So it is for the first time that you're seeing this film on the big screen. So this is an immensely kind of welcome privilege that we're having here in Singapore. And so without further ado, we will begin the screenings, and we hope you enjoy the films. Thank you. And we hope that the films have offered you deeper insight into the life and career of Dora and sparked your curiosity to dive deeper into the remarkable women artists featured in Speculative Entanglements. I also want to mention that a much longer biopic length film, right, of Dora is available actually for sale as a DVD. Yes, if you visit Dorich House, or is it circulated also on the internet for sale? Okay, if you do go by Dorich House. Okay, yes, but please, if you're interested in the feature-length biopic that Annaleena made, that's also available for sale. But without further ado, it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Fiona Fisher to share her reflections on Gordine's extensive travel across Asia and contemporary relevance of Dora Gordine's work. Dr. Fisher is a member of the Modern Interiors Research Centre at Kingston University and the curator of the university's Dorich House Museum. Her research spans modern public house design in England, British domestic interiors in the context of suburban modernity, and the design of English care homes. She's the author and editor of several books, and more recently she contributed to The Senses in Interior Design, Sensorial Expression and Experiences, published in 2024, and co-edited Exhibition as Interior, Interior as Exhibition, Spaces of Display Within and Beyond the Museum and Gallery, published in 2025. Currently, she's collaborating with Dr. Rebecca Preston on a study of the history of London's roof gardens. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Fisher.
Thanks, Adele. So firstly, I'm really delighted to be here in Singapore on International Women's Day, a place of great significance, as you've already seen, for Dora Gordine's career as an artist. I'd like to thank Erika Tan and her colleagues for arranging today's event and for all of their support in realising the loan of 2 works from our Dorich House collections at Kingston University, and it's really wonderful to have them on display here at the moment. I'm going to say a little bit more about them in my talk this afternoon, which is going to give an overview of Dora Gordine's time living and working in Asia from 1930 to 1935. Before I go further, I think I'd really like to acknowledge the significant research on Gordine by my former colleagues at Kingston University, Jonathan Black, Fran Lloyd and Brenda Martin, and that of the researchers, artists and curators internationally who have since enriched our knowledge of Gordine's life and work and continued to stimulate reappraisals of it, not least the contributions of Erika Tan and Annaleena Piel Linnå, which you have just seen. So Dora Gordine arrived in Singapore in January 1930 and was based principally in Johor Bahru until her permanent return to Europe in May 1935. The early impression she made, as well as her ability to engage others with her sculpture, is captured in an article of August 1930 in the Straits Times, in which the author commented, "Her personality is her enthusiasm for sculpture. When she talks of it, her face is animated, and she infects her listeners with something of that enthusiasm." As a newly arrived single woman artist, Gordine cut a somewhat unusual figure in Singapore. Observations were made on her Russianness and on her slightly foreign accent. In Europe, certain art critics had already drawn a line between Gordine's Russian identity and a supposed native feeling for what was termed the East in her work. Gerald Reitlinger in 1928 described Gordine's sculptural works as having a very un-European spirit, likening it to that of classical Buddhist sculpture from India and Japan, and stating, "It is not surprising that a Russian, midway between Europe and the East, in spirit, should have seized it." Later that year, the French art critic Lucien Cordier also placed Gordine in an intermediate position, describing her as an Asiatic, caught between the Orient and the West. Similar comment on her Russian identity, which might suggest how it may have been more widely perceived here, was made soon after Gordine's arrival in Singapore, when writer Winifred Ponder proposed that it was doubtless to her Russian birth that Gordine owed her affinity with the East and her superlative success in expressing its spirit. As the 2 examples of late 1920s European criticism indicate, Gordine's interest in Asian subjects and cultures predated her arrival in Singapore. It was perhaps initially stimulated by the Russian Orientalist Alexei Bayov. Bayov, a student of Sanskrit, China and Mongolia, was one of her earliest known sitters. His portrait was exhibited in Estonia in 1921 before Gordine moved to Paris. Its current whereabouts is unknown. It is also worth noting that early in her professional life in Estonia, Gordine lived at Tatari Street in the centre of the Tatar community of Turkic-speaking peoples in Tallinn, and that throughout her career she based herself in or on the fringe of major cosmopolitan cities. Did this local context in Tallinn perhaps inspire her later work, Mongolian Head, also titled Head of a Tartar Woman, 1926-8, shown here. By the late 1920s, Gordine had begun to establish a professional reputation as a sculptor of talent, having exhibited in Paris, London and Berlin, where she had become known for specialising in what were then described as exotic subjects. Other works of the 1920s, including the major female figure Javanese Dancer of 1927-8 and Head of a Woman of 1925, similarly reveal her interest in non-Western subjects, something that was shared by many European artists at the time, as well as a love of dance, which is reflected in her later drawings of Balinese temple dancers, completed in Bali, and a series of small sculptural works on the theme of the spirit of the ballet, completed later in London. Gordine's time in Asia, principally spent in Southeast Asia, was highly productive. She created significant new works, 23 catalogued works of sculpture, including 4 large figures, as well as numerous drawings and paintings. She also travelled extensively and later drawn her experiences in a series of 9 articles for the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society entitled Masterpieces of Oriental Art, published between 1943 and 1947. The series covered, among other subjects, Indian, Khmer and Chinese sculpture. Written from Gordine's critical perspective as a sculptor, rather than an academic or scholarly one, they reflect her deep interest, observation, and personal response to historical examples in her chosen medium. She also spoke about various aspects of Southeast Asian art at British universities and societies between 1941 and 1944. But to step back to 1930, what attracted Gordine to leave Europe and settle in Johor rather than elsewhere in Asia? Critically, as you've heard, she had existing contacts here, including Dr. George Herbert Garlick, pictured here with Gordine, to whom she was married in Singapore in September 1930, acquiring British citizenship. They had first met in Paris in around 1929. Garlick, a physician, was appointed principal medical officer for Johor State in 1930. He is remembered as an important figure here in rural public health and for his leadership of anti-tuberculosis initiatives here in Singapore. There's a plaque dedicated to his memory very close by in St Andrew's Cathedral. More pertinent to understanding Gordine's life and work, Garlick was also an art lover and a collector of European and Asian art, and was well connected, opening possibilities for local patronage among the British community and beyond. Gordine also knew Roland Braddell, a Singapore-based lawyer and advisor to the Sultan of Johor. Braddell was a great advocate for the arts, had personal aspirations for Singapore to establish its own art gallery, and may have raised the possibility of sculptural commissions in Singapore before Gordine left Europe. And further encouragement perhaps came from Gordine's recent acquaintance with a young German artist, Fritz Kronenberg, who was freshly returned from 2 years travelling in Egypt, India, Java and Bali. Notwithstanding the challenge of adjusting to the local climate, Gordine appears to have settled to work quickly. In the supplement to the Straits budget of 17th of April 1930, she is shown in her ATAP studio in Johor Bahru with a work described as Head of a Chinese Woman in China Clay. The image shown here, and apologies for the poor quality of this newspaper reproduction, is the only one found to date of the outside of her studio, the exact location of which remains uncertain. She had also found a photographer, F.J. Troysen, to document her work. Troysen, a master at the English College in Johor Bahru, appears to have been a dedicated amateur photographer. Gordine was alert to the power of media throughout her career, and good visual documentation of her sculpture was central to its dissemination. Several of Troysen's photographic prints of Gordine's work are held in the collections of the Royal Society of Sculptors in London, and some of these were published here in newspapers, English language newspapers, during her time here. They form a very important record of her Asian works, as well as offering glimpses into her studio. In August 1930, Roland Braddell wrote to Singapore's municipal commissioners, suggesting that they place an order with Miss Gordine for sculpture for each of the hall landings of the city's new municipal buildings, a landmark architectural project for the city, which is now the City Hall wing of the National Gallery, initiating what was to become a significant public sculpture commission, unprecedented at the time for a woman artist. From January to March 1931, while Braddell's proposal was under consideration, Gordine travelled through what were then Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina and Siam. She visited sites including Borobudur on Java, the Khmer site of Angkor, before returning to Singapore via Bangkok, where she reportedly spent time studying the collections at the National Museum. Before returning to Europe in 1935, Gordine also visited India, Bali and China. In July 1931, Garlick and Gordine held a party to celebrate the opening of her new studio, and this was reported in the local newspaper. Photographs taken at that time show Gordine at work on a small reclining female figure, and again, the exact location of this studio remains uncertain. The purchase of sculpture for the new municipal buildings was, after a notable discussion, ultimately approved, and it was to include two of Gordine's existing works completed in the second half of the 1920s, Walking Male Torso and Mongolian Head, and four new works completed in Johor, Chinese Head, Hindu Head, Malay Head and Javanese Head. The images at the bottom of the screen show the casts held in our Dorich House collections. Gordine's works were cast in bronze in editions of up to 8, and some of the Dorich House examples vary in colour from the patination of those that were actually acquired for display here in Singapore. The funds for the project came from a bequest left by Mr. K.W.B. Van Cleef for the embellishment of the town in around 1929 to 30. These works were described at the time as heads of Eastern or racial types and as representing 5 nationalities: Chinese, Mongolian, Javanese, Malay and Hindu. 2 heads were to stand at the top of the exterior steps, 2 on the floor above next to the council chamber, and the male torso was to be placed, I'm quoting, in the middle of the space there which overlooks the sea, prominent locations within the building. The selection of works representing Singapore's Chinese, Javanese, Malay and Indian subjects aligned with the purpose of the municipal buildings as a seat and visible statement of colonial power exercised through policies which segmented society along racial and ethnic lines. Less obvious, however, is the reason behind the selection of the 2 earlier works, Mongolian Head and Walking Male Torso. While recognising Gordine's privileged position within this colonial context, the nature of the artist-subject relationship is, as Fran Lloyd has indicated, complicated by her status. And I'm quoting here, questions of racial or ethnic stereotyping are particularly complex in the case of Gordine, who, in terms of her émigré status in Europe, her unfixed nationality, her undeclared Jewish birth, and her positioning as a woman sculptor, drawing directly from the life model, opens up a number of potential points of identification with her non-Western sitters. It was noted in the Straits budget that the final casting of the works in bronze would take place in Paris, as there was no local capability to cast them here using the traditional cire perdu or lost wax process. It was hoped, however, that the municipal workshops would soon be able to do this. In August 1932, Gordine returned to Europe, travelling with Dr. Garlick to her studio home in Paris to supervise the finishing of the work. What do we know about the models for Gordine's works? And this is something that was raised in Erika's film. Except for a portrait head of the elder sister of the Sultan of Johor, the only identified subjects of the sculptural works Gordine realised in Asia are of European sitters, and these give an indication of her local connections and patrons. Diana, the daughter of Sir William Murison, Chief Justice of the Straits Settlements. Beatrice Farrer, the daughter of Roland J. Farrer, President of Singapore's Municipal Commissioners, who was instrumental in securing Gordine's work for the municipal buildings. Louise Evelyn Mackintosh, the mother of Mrs. Doris Evelyn Lang, a painter and interior decorator, who was married to Philip Lang, the Assistant Secretary of the Singapore Turf Club. A portrait tentatively identified as being of Wilhelmina Biller Margaret Cresswell. A portrait head of the zoologist, Cecil Boden-Kloss, director of the Raffles Museum from 1923 to 1932, and Gordine herself. Little is known about the identities of her other models. One brief newspaper article suggesting that the artist's model for Gordine's Malay head also modelled for a head by the German sculptor Tina Venture, who exhibited here in 1936, raises more questions than it answers. Venture's work, and again apologies for the poor quality of the newspaper reproduction, is shown to the right of the screen. So even though this correlation between the two is identified, the name of the young Malay woman remains unknown. Among the other notable works completed by Gordine during her time here are this large standing female figure, exhibited in Iran and later retitled for exhibition as Goddess of Health. In this photograph taken in Gordine's studio, you can just see the shadowy presence of local assistants behind the large cloth that's being held as a backdrop to photography of the work. Gordine's self-portrait, which was exhibited at the Leicester Galleries in London in 1938. And in 1935, Gordine commented that she had completed her best work to date, a sculpture of a seated woman. It seems likely that she was referring to this pagan, this large seated figure. As you can see here, drawing was part of Gordine's sculptural process. The assured form of this large preparatory drawing for pagan, which is one of 3 that she made, suggests the impact of her experience of the Khmer sculpture at Angkor and the Buddhist stone carvings that she saw in Java. It is shown alongside a photograph of the work taken here, the work in our Dorich House collections, and the work on display in the garden of Dr Garlick's Roundhouse in Singapore. At Dorich House, pagan was placed in an architecturally significant setting within Gordine's gallery soon after its completion in 1936. And it remains in this location as a very powerful female presence within the space. Another female figure, Sinhalese girl, proved popular with collectors and suggests Gordine's growing awareness of Indian sculpture. The work appeared in an article in the Malayan Saturday Post in 1931. The photograph to the right shows the work on display again in Dr Garlick's home, in the garden of Dr Garlick's home in Singapore. Garlick's eldest daughter has recalled modelling for Sinhalese girl in Paris when Gordine wanted to complete some adjustments to the spine of the figure before it was cast in bronze. Several works photographed during Gordine's time here or subsequently have not been located. Among these are Gordine's portrait heads of Cecil Boden-Kloss, Louise Evelyn Mackintosh, and a young Malay boy. A small reclining figure, which may be the recumbent female figure she exhibited at the Leicester Galleries in London in 1933. And a female head of uncertain material pictured here in the garden of Dr Garlick's home. This house in Garlick Avenue in Singapore was demolished in the early 1980s. As part of the story of Gordine's links to Singapore, I'd now like to take a very brief detour and say a few words about Elizabeth Choi, a significant and heroic woman in Singapore's 20th century history, whose life is well documented. After the occupation of Singapore, Choi and her husband became involved in the resistance movement, and to mark her bravery, Choi was flown to Britain in 1946 to receive an OBE from King George VI. She met Gordine the following year and was the model for 2 small figures, Flawless Crystal, which we hold in our Dorich House collections, and Serene Jade, which is held in the National Gallery's collections and is on display here, along with the female head on the right, both of which were gifted to the National Gallery by the Choi family. In an interview of 2004, Choi recalled Gordine's satisfaction with Flawless Crystal and Serene Jade, noting she had wanted to complete 2 further works, one to be titled Peerless Blossom and the other Beautiful Cloud. Choi, however, had to return to Singapore, and these final 2 works were never realised. As well as preparatory drawings for sculpture, Gordine made many other drawings during her time in Asia. These include sketches and more finished drawings of indigenous peoples from Southeast Asia, sketches of subjects from the then British Empire in Asia, including people from Malaya and Sarawak, and of the then Dutch East Indies, notably people from Bali. Most of these drawings focus on the body or the face rather than the wider scene, capturing Gordine's intense fascination with the diverse peoples of the regions and places she visited, their features, their personalities, their movement and personal style, which ranged from the traditional to the fashionably modern dress. Among them are this detailed and powerful studio portrait head of a local Malay fisherman with his distinctive headscarf, which is currently displayed here on loan. According to Richard Hare, who travelled with Gordine in Asia, she also started painting seriously during her time here and had become deeply absorbed in it. The two paintings shown, both held in the Dorich House collections, are catalogued as Lady of Java and Portrait of a Burmese Woman. However, in an article on Gordine's London home, published in the Straits Times in 1953, years after her return to Europe, writer Dorothy Thatcher relayed Gordine's own account of the paintings, in which she explained that they were of the same young Malay woman who was first painted while she was an occupant of what was then called the Johor Lunatic Asylum, the painting Portrait of a Burmese Woman, and later, on her recovery, the painting titled Lady of Java. These two paintings raise questions over the historical titling and cataloguing of work, and the potential slippage or erasure of subject identities that can take place during that process. And you can see Portrait of a Burmese Woman on display here on loan from our Dorich House collections. Gordine's time in Johor and Singapore not only propelled her creative development, but also informed how she chose to live on her return to London. And I would like to conclude with some brief remarks on her homes, which were so integral to her work and its production, display and sale. To the left of the screen is Dorich House, which was completed in late 1936 to Gordine's personal specifications, and in its architecture and interiors reflects her deep attachment to Asia, as well as influences from her earlier homes, notably her Paris studio home. In the centre is a photograph of Dr Garlick on the roof of his roundhouse in Singapore while it was under construction. The house was completed in around 1937. No architect has been identified, and Garlick's family recognise him as the designer. Gordine never lived in the roundhouse, but as previously shown, her work was displayed in and around the house and grounds after her return to Europe, and certain questions remain over the extent to which Gordine may have had a hand in its design. What has to date been absent from this picture is knowledge of the home Gordine and Garlick shared. A recently discovered newspaper article on Garlick's Johor home, published in 1936, so just after Gordine had left but before the roundhouse was completed, helps fill this missing link between her Paris, Johor and London homes. The article likened Garlick's home here to a house designed in Paris or other European capitals with advanced ideas in interiors, and described the hygienic basis of its design, the rich mixture of English and Asian objects and artworks in their display, alongside modern heads by one of the foremost sculptresses of the day, evidently Gordine. Longer descriptions of these interiors resonate with and open new possibilities for interpreting the spaces of Dorich House in relation to Gordine's work. You can see here her first floor studio and gallery, top floor living and dining room with its connecting moon door. And I hope this can add new dimensions to our understanding of their design and other aspects of the enduring significance of Gordine's time here in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
So before we begin, just to introduce Erika. Born and educated in Singapore, Erika Tan moved to the UK to study anthropology, filmmaking and fine art. Her research-based practice investigates received narratives, contested heritage, subjugated voices, and transnational movements of ideas, people and things. Her work has been shown internationally, including the Jakarta Biennale, the Diaspora Pavilion in Venice, and institutions such as the gallery here, the Tate, Taipei Fine Arts Museum, ZKM, and many others. Erika Tan is also reader in contemporary art practice and the MFA course leader at the Central St. Martin's. Hi, Erika. I was going to not know which way to turn in order to address you, but I shan't actually look behind, but look in front, because that's how you will see us. I just want to get you in on the conversation first, to maybe share with us the motivation for making speculative entanglements.
Okay. Firstly, thanks for the invite. Also wonderful to hear the update of Fiona's research in Dorich House and Dora Gordine. There's loads of new material there that I wasn't aware of when I started the project. The impetus was really, I had a residency in Stanley Picker, which is the sister organization to Dorich House. And unbeknownst to me, there was a connection that I didn't realize. In fact, there are some slides I've got. Maybe we could just briefly go through some of the slides I sent through. Right, so what I'd probably like to do is just contextualize the way in which the film that you've just seen was actually shown. It's part of a broader project called Barang Barang. And the way the film was shown was to see the film alongside objects that come from both the collection from Dorich House, but also my own work and the work of my mother's. So it was very much an exploration of various kinds of legacies of women artists. So if we just look at that image and then go through to the next one. Yes, so there's the film on the right, a 2-screen piece, and then on the left, there's a series of objects. If we go on to the next one. And again. So you can see here, we're looking through the objects into seeing the projection. And if we go to the next slide. Okay, so that's, I'll come, if we just keep going, I want to find a slide that's, keep going. Next one. Keep going. Okay, there. Yeah, that one. So the top images of the Singapore Art History Galleries, the first time National Gallery installed or hung the Singapore kind of art history section of National Gallery. This is where Dora's works were. And when I got the residency in Kingston, I hadn't actually realized that I had actually filmed Dora Gordine's work in my commission with the National Gallery. And so starting the residency, I sort of started with this kind of shock and surprise that in this West London neighborhood, there was a connection to Singapore that I had been so unaware of, but had grown up with. So the 4 racial head types were probably works that I'd seen as a child, and they had actually been registered in a film that I'd made, and I wanted to explore that connection. A lot of my work is exploring the transnational connections between Singapore and Britain. So I think it was that sense of going somewhere in the UK where I'm based and suddenly being confronted with something that connects me to Singapore and to Asia, and to recognize that there was in Dorich House this whole kind of history that had got some information but hadn't really been fully delved into by researchers as much as it perhaps should have. It was an embarking, I think, conversation. Fiona probably can testify to that. I think Fiona's done a lot of work since I first met her on Dora's Asian connections. So yes, in a way it was trying to find connections that brought me to focus on the work. Sorry, I'm not getting much feedback on the sound, so I'm a little bit feeling in a vacuum. So I'll stop there, and if there's anything else you want to ask, please do.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you might share a little bit more about how the other artistic figures came into play together with Dora.
So I was doing 2 things at once. I had the legacy of my mother's work. She had died about a decade earlier, but I was starting to deal with what she'd left behind as an artist and as an individual. And I was also looking at Dora and the way in which the museum studio house kind of collected, had this context for an artist that were so clearly connected to the individual artist, but also pointed further away to Singapore. And that very sort of same period of time was when Dora's work was shown in the Singapore context as a potential, I suppose, to opening up the question of Singapore art history. So the way in which that Singapore art history gallery was constructed was Dora's work was quite central to the early kind of history of Singapore art. And I was curious about the question of how some artists are collected and incorporated into art histories and into national canons, and how some artists are not. So in trying to deal with my mother's work and thinking about her own practice, 35 years worth of living and making work in Singapore, how her work was in my hands and not in any other collection, and what might I do perhaps to think about how her work could be collected. And that also then made me reflect on my own lack of kind of presence within art collections in Singapore. And of course then that led to thinking about, because that period of time when the National Gallery was developing its collection was also a period of time where Kim Lim's work was being acquired. More work was being done on women artists, but also very clearly that there was a lack of women artists, especially representation of Malay women artists in the National Collection. Again, previous works I've worked on kind of focuses on this. So there was an opportunity in a way to think laterally about national art canons and the way they're constructed in relationship to key figures like Georgette, who is obviously a pioneer artist and would have been included in the national art canon. Kim Lim, who became incorporated into the national art canon through a kind of rather belated acquiring of her work around the particular period of time where the National Gallery was being developed. And then Dora's work that was already here in Singapore, but perhaps we weren't even fully aware of who she was. And then sort of piggybacking on that was thinking about my mother in relationship to these artists, and also then thinking about myself. So is the national canon developed through engagement with the Singapore context? Is it through birth? Is it through cultural association? Is it through schooling? On what basis is a national canon constructed? Those were the sort of primary questions, I think, that led me to think about the possibilities of bringing these four rather disparate women together, and five if I include myself.
Thanks so much, Erika, for also bringing into play the gendered aspects for our awareness, which also brings to mind something I was kind of curious about, and maybe Fiona can kind of lead into this, which was Dora's own relationship with other female artists. There are very many men that we have seen around her life, but this is kind of counterposed by Erika's film, which is 4 women artists.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think not much evidence of other women artists that she was working alongside, but not much evidence of male artists either. I think she really did follow her own path. She didn't particularly have... She taught, but she didn't particularly have followers, so there's no legacy through her followers. And she didn't have a particular mentor, although she always spoke of Mile with great respect. She had young artist women friends when she was in Estonia, but after that, I think less so. And I think it's interesting thinking about those Estonian connections, because actually that network now is being explored. These 3 sisters, the Mai sisters, there's been quite a lot of work on them in Estonia by Kai Stahl and by curators at Kumu. There's been a recent exhibition. So where Gordine has been networked with these women and these women are being reinvestigated, she's appearing in that picture. But in terms of some of the issues Erika was talking about around institutional practices and collecting, one of the interesting things for me is that although there is a sort of reassessment, I think, of Gordine's place within Estonia, because she left there before much work was made or acquired, she's not present in collections in Estonia. So a recent exhibition where you would have expected her perhaps to feature really prominently was around women self-representation in Finland and Estonia, creating the self. But she's not in that exhibition because the exhibition was based on women in collections in Finland and Estonia. So she vanishes from that part of the history, and I think it tells us a lot about where there are these presences and absences for artists, especially artists who are moving around in different international contexts, and how that form of institutional practice lends against. So I've come off the point of her women artist friends, but in a circuitous route, I hope that says something else that might be useful to our conversation in thinking about, how some of these more transnational figures appear and disappear from different places.
I guess I like to look at the web of relationships that artists build vis-a-vis other artists, or the kind of own self-reckoning or shaping of the subjectivity. But I want to talk about the senses of reclamation, right, of national art histories trying to reclaim, these figures as, the research intensifies. Because that also comes up in Erika's film, that point about Kim Lim being suddenly Singaporean. Yeah, so I just wondered if you might share your own kind of thoughts. Erika, too, also about these senses of being reclaimed, as you might also be reclaimed by NGS.
Yeah, one thing to say is that I think there's also a question around methodology in art histories here. And I just wanted to say that the way in which I made the film, what was really important was to take the archival material and factual kind of interviews and conversations and press cuttings. And as an artist, I then scripted these into some kind of potential conversation. But equally important was the engagement with the performers themselves. And in terms of reclaiming, I think the performers also do something in the work that I'm setting up, but I'm not in control of, which is when the figure or the performer who's performing Kim Lim, she's provided with a kind of a script and information about Kim Lim. But when she's talking about Kim Lim, it comes from what she has remembered from the material I've given her, but she constructs the sentences herself. And as a Chinese performer in the UK, what I became very aware of was her own reclaiming of certain parts of Kim Lim's story that actually also potentially talk about her own position within the context of the UK. So for me, there's a way in which the film operates with the contemporary, which is maybe a little bit of a break from the art historical. And you can see that so clearly in the sort of fabrications that happen in my piece compared perhaps to the way in which Fiona talks about a very in-depth kind of developing kind of and changing landscape of Dora's history through the factual. So in terms of reclamation, yes, it's really interesting how somebody's story like Kim Lim's story has changed through the art historical engagement, but also within the film that Kim Lim's own sort of bio changes through the performativity of the performer and their mediation of the history. So maybe that's what I want to say in a way, is that there is a kind of sense in which I'm very interested in the way that history is mediated from the position of the contemporary and potentially from practitioners, stakeholders in a contemporary situation who are trying to find their way in the world and locate themselves and develop a context for their own work.
Yes, I think it's quite a difficult question, I think, for me to answer in terms of Gordine's presences and absences sort of across that global context that she's positioned in. I think one of the things that I found really interesting about the work that's being done here is how she's shifting as sculpture's rethought. So I think the Rethinking Sculpture in Singapore work that was done here at National Gallery has placed her in a different context. So sometimes it's not so much that she's absent or being reclaimed, more that she's being repositioned in certain places. And the Rethinking Sculpture research and project was really to look at sculpture here in an expanded field that was beyond fine art practice and included craft-based practices that had been marginalised in the past. And that process of writing more inclusive histories necessarily moves some figures that have been marginal and reclaimed, pushes them perhaps out to the margins slightly again in certain ways. And I find that really interesting. I mean, obviously the writing of more inclusive histories is entirely to be welcomed, but this reframing of everything around it I find really interesting in relation to Gordine and how she's being resituated in this national context. And I think I am really curious as to see what will happen now that there's more work on the May sisters out and available, and that they're more well known in Estonia, and that what will happen as a result of Gordine being part of that network, whether she will be brought more back into the centre of things there or not. But again, there is this issue of the lack of work. I mean, we do sit on most of the Gordine. I should be really clear. We do hold most of Gordine's work at Dorich House, so there's a limited amount of her work in circulation internationally and available for acquisition by institutions. And as we all know, what's borrowed for exhibition gets written about, and these things have a great bearing on how artists are thought about in the future and how histories are written. You know, exhibition catalogues absolutely fundamental, and I think, you know, tracing Gordine's life through exhibition catalogues, you can see where she's disappeared, really sort of in the mid part of the 20th century, and how it's from the late 1980s with a reconsideration of sculpture in Britain that she starts to be revalued, I think, as someone who was really at the forefront of figurative art in the 1920s and was recognised as being a talented figure. And then the work that's come since then, the exhibitions that have come since then, including retrospective exhibition in Kingston and a retrospective in Tallinn, have built on that. So there's been a process of writing her history that's been going on really quite actively since the 1980s, which exhibition making has been part of.
I'm aware of time, so I've just one last question. And since you brought in Dorich House Museum, there is an analogy in the film, in Erika's film, about the snail, House of the Snail being broken apart and then stuck together, and then did the snail survive? I thought it was quite a useful analogy for me to think through about the Dorich House Museum, and then how it functions, about how it leads us to read the artists, you know, how does that domicile, but also the space of work, right? Because that's a studio as well. How does that help us to get to grips with Dora herself? Or, as you also somehow suggest, that slightly entombs her a little bit. But then again, with more research that you have just shared, I now see the works in gardens, which I've never really seen before. Sculptures outdoors. There are these other spaces where her legacies are felt, right? The roundhouse. So there are actually much more Dora houses out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the snail is a really, really interesting thing for someone that has had to move all the time. It's a great analogy. I mean, I think with Dorich House, I think firstly, I think you've seen pictures of the outside of the building. I mean, it appears as a giant piece of sculpture in a suburban landscape in the southwest of Kingston. So I think it advertises itself as a place of activity rather than as a home. I think you might not understand that it's a studio house, but I think what you do understand when you think about it or see it or try to make some connection in your head, the nearest thing you might get to is a factory. So I think it does tell you something about her on the outside and how she wanted to promote herself. It wasn't designed to be grand or ornate. It was designed to be a highly functional building with 2 studios and with a gallery that would give her the independence to manage her career in the way that she wanted to work in the way that she wanted to. We know that green outlooks were important to her. It overlooks one of our royal parks in London, Richmond Park. So it was set up really to give her the capacity to work in the way that she wanted and to live in the way that she wanted. But wrapped into, sort of enfolded into that house are so many parts of her history and life. And I think that's really fascinating to me. And in Erika's film, you'll have seen the moon doors, the Chinese moon doors opened and closed. So she's building in architectural references from her time here into the house. It's a highly, highly personal environment, and these things are clearly really meaningful to her, that she's not just hanging things on her wall, she's physically integrating her history into the building. And we can see this as well in fireplaces in Dorich House, which are exact copies of the fireplaces from her Perret studio house in Paris. So she's bringing these things with her that are meaningful to her and that create an environment that sustain her and fuel her and allow her to make her work, alongside other things such as Chinese frescoes set into the walls of her apartment on the top floor of the house, repurposed rice workers' hats, which she turned into lampshades. So you feel these connections very strongly, I think, when you walk around Dorich House, but also her connections to other places that she lived. So I think as a studio home of a woman artist, with a large collection of their work still in place and much of that work made in the house, it's a very unique environment and a very special environment that tells us a lot about her, but also tells us about what happens when artists don't have a place or archives don't have a place, and become fragmented. History comes back to Dorich House all the time. People bring back stories, people bring back work, people bring photographs of work that's in their family that they don't know the history of. And so we're a repository for a lot of that knowledge that's just coming back to us without us having to search for it. So I think the strength of that sort of vision and identity is really linked to legacy is very, very important.
Thank you, Fiona. Maybe the last word to Erika on also the experience of filming in Dorich House, but also that the particular character of the house lends itself to this kind of prismatic structure of the film that you've created.
Yeah, if anyone knows my work, I love I love buildings, and Dorich House was wonderful to film in, primarily because of those kind of echoes to Asia within them. However, I mean, I could talk for ages. The floor creaks, so you can't get good, quiet sound. There's something that you realize about lighting in the space, that the design of the house is, allows a lot of light in. Fiona will probably go into more detail if you asked her, but the one side of the house has a kind of northern light, which means it's sort of ambient and it can kind of doesn't cast harsh shadows, doesn't create a very contrasting kind of look, very good for sort of all-round sculptural work, but maybe also drawings, I think. And then the other side of the house has much more contrast. yeah, as an artist as well, being in a house that a woman has designed, and the largest spaces in the house are given over to the production of work, and the smallest spaces are the most sort of intimate, but they're the domestic space where Dora lived with her husband, and they're very they're suddenly small when you've gone through these big gallery spaces that she presented and made her work in. I think it's quite also in London, where space is so expensive, one can't help but feel really incredibly jealous in a way of the way that she managed to set herself up to really give herself the opportunity to make the work that she wanted to make. And of course, yeah, I mean, I can only look on with, yeah, some kind of jealousy, but the opportunity to film was too much. So just really glad that I made that possible. I think the thing about working in spaces like that is that the uniqueness of each space comes through the work that you make. And so it echoes into, and a viewer who hasn't gone to Dorich House won't understand necessarily why there's a moon door, but it's there. And it infuses the whole conversation between East and West, I think, as well, because we are what potentially looks like a space in the UK, but then again, we've got these echoes to somewhere else that are informing the way in which an audience might perceive those conversations taking place as well, I think. So, yeah.
Forget. There is a question that my colleague wanted to ask about you intervening into the space or the exhibition, or the collection rather, because you had your exhibition at the Stanley Picker, where you turned your bronze heads, or Dora Gordine's bronze heads of unidentified Asian subjects, and turned them away from visitors. Would you be able to share a bit of your thinking behind this curatorial gesture?
Yeah, maybe we can get the slides back up and just go to the ones where we've got all the backs of the heads. I'm not sure if, yes, there we go. This isn't an image actually of what we did, because Fiona and I cannot find the image of what took place. But I was thinking about, in terms of a gesture, it's a gesture of refusal. So the way in which, and you hear Dora being fascinated with the Asian face and the Asian portrait, and the way she got access perhaps to these sitters, but they're not named. And in the film itself, I brought all the heads together and actually filmed the heads in one space. The Asian heads are not put together in Dorich House. That was an intervention already in the filming, to sort of bring them all together for us to be able to observe them and rotate around them. And then in the exhibition, the heads in Dorich House, if I remember correctly, Fiona, we turned most of the Asian heads around in the spaces that they were in, so as to not have a returned engagement, but a refusal of being seen. A small gesture, but one that I wanted to sort of play around with. Alongside that, there was also the use of the Chinese philosopher to do a live sort of streaming, a 12-hour streaming of his of the sculpture, to put him on a video, a bit like a Nanjun Pike, really, to put him opposite Dora Gordine's portrait in the foyer, to have a sort of face-off between these two individuals. Partly because Dora's seemed like one of the significances of Dora was seen in relationship to her Asian and exotic heads. So if we took that away perhaps from her, or we tried to find a way of pushing back, what kind of a conversation would there be at this point in time between those sitters and Dora now? Is really the question, I suppose, being asked.
I want to open the floor up for questions, if there are any. So there is a mic. Any? No? Jiqian.
Hi, thanks very much for this. It really connected a lot of things that we puzzled about the that era. I had encountered Dora Gordine's sculpture as a student, and then I was on the architectural committee to look at the construction of or sort of museological planning for the gallery, and the city hall was part of it, and then I never quite made the connection. So where those statues the heads were being placed is slightly clearer. I think I want to know a bit more, but it also opened up so many, both the films and your talk opened up the whole world of 1930s, where there were all these philanthropists like Van Cleef and people like Roland, what's that? Bradel, yeah, and also Garlick himself. And I've not seen that house before, so maybe we can look at the records and see how those things are made. But I just wanted to say thank you, and maybe we can continue to do more research about some of these aspects that you've discussed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chi Kian. On that note of continuation, I'm going to wrap this session up, and so that we may continue conversations out in the foyer where refreshments await everybody. So thank you all very much for your wonderful, kind attention today on International Women's Day. Big round of applause for Fiona, Erika, and also Annaleena.